chairing this session, but for unavoidable reasons I've taken it over. I'm Mark Edwards. Our first speaker on Cyril of Alexandria will be Sir Hovorun, and his title, Cyril of Alexandria, a Phenomenological Theologian, ?
Thank you. Thank you. The patterns of thinking of the fathers are usually analyzed in the framework of the classical philosophy, Platonism, Aristotelianism, Stoicism, etc. It is not often that these patterns are placed in the framework of the modern philosophy for obvious reasons. The modern philosophy could have not exercised any impact on the patristic thought. Nevertheless, the modern philosophical frames are not useless in analyzing patristics. In my presentation, I will apply the modern epistemological approaches to the theology of Cyril of Alexandria and his followers. This, I believe, will make clearer the difference between Cyril and the factions of his disciples. I will consider Cyril and the Cyrilites from the points of view of phenomenology and analytic philosophy. So it's a bit of speculation, but I think it is useful to understand better the difference between Cyril and his followers. The two philosophical approaches can be legitimately applied to Christology because the Christological controversies were also about the structures of perception, how we recognize Christ. Some theologians perceived him from the theoretical perspective, starting with the idea of incarnation and ending up with at the observable reality of Jesus. Some followed the opposite path, from the observation of a single alive reality of Christ to contemplation of his Godhead united with his humanity. Indeed, how do we perceive Christ? Starting with the idea that God became incarnated, which makes us stressing his two natures, or starting with the reality of Jesus as a single being with whom his disciples conversed, ate, traveled. Then we stress unity in Christ. Phenomenology and the analytic philosophy of mind as epistemological disciplines are capable of addressing such questions. In my presentation, I will reduce the scope of this potentially huge discussion to the figure of Cyril of Alexandria. My argument is Cyril in his Christological deliberations was closer to what we now know as phenomenology. Indeed, his main point was that unity of the humanity and divinity in Christ that this unity is observable, while his duality can be only contemplated in mind. It exists de theoria moni. Cyril thus arrived at the concept of unity on the basis of the observation of Jesus as a single alive being, and zone. He went opposite to Nestorius, who in emphasizing duality dwelt on the theoretical premises, which stressed the two natures in Christ over his oneness. From this point of view, Cyril was closer, I believe, to phenomenology, which, in the words of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, is a matter, I quote him, is a matter of describing, not of explaining or analyzing. End of quote. Phenomenology gives priority to things as they appear in the consciousness of a person, not to that which a person may want to think about the things themselves. It is, I quote de Montmorin, it is reviving our living contact with reality. Cyril was this kind of realist in his Christological deliberations. Quite in tune with the modern phenomenology, Cyril did not pay enough attention to the language he used to express the reality he described. Hence is his freedom to use formulas which do not look consistent or clear. His famous one nature of the incarnated Son, mia physis theoulosis archomeno, was far from analytic clarity, but expressed well the observable reality of Christ's unity. This formula is a good example of what the phenomenological bracketing can be. By bracketing, according to David Woodrow Smith and Amy Thomason, and this is a crucial concept in the entire phenomenological construct, I quote those two authors, by bracketing we can address our experience as representing things in the world in certain ways, rather than using our experience so to represent things in the world. This move is similar to placing a piece of language in quotation marks, say when we are mentioning what a witness said, rather than using those words to make an assertion ourselves. Quotation thus enables us to address the meaningful content of a piece of language without committing ourselves to its truth. End of quote. Indeed, the formula one nature of the incarnated Son became referential for the generations of the followers of Cyril. It became particularly useful in the framework of Neo-Chalcedonianism, as a reference addressing the meaningful content without commitment to its original truth. As a philosophical method, phenomenology became famous for overcoming the neo-Kantian dilemma of subject-object. Cyril was far from such a dichotomy when he was speaking about Christ. He was not an abstract thinker about Christ, but a man of prayer and contemplation, which overcome the divide between a cognizing subject and a cognized object. His method of theology could be described, but what in phenomenology can be called intentionality. This concept goes back to the medieval theology, and in the interpretation of the phenomenologists means that the act of perception implies an aboutness of our consciousness with respect to the object of our cognition, reaching out to it over the subject-object divide. This aboutness made Cyril speaking of Christ not as an abstract model, but an alive reality. Cyril's formula, one nature of the incarnated Son, as well as some other theological statements that he made, caused fervent discussions among his followers. Absence of clarity in his language provoked controversies that eventually led to one of the largest schisms in the Christian Church. If Cyril were more analytic, probably the controversy would have been less intense. At the same time, probably this would not have made his views as widely received as they actually happened to be. Lack of clarity, which is a feature of the phenomenological philosophy, in their teachers' writings urged the followers of Cyril to take a more analytic approach regarding Christology and Cyril's own theology. It has been widely accepted that the analytic approach, I quote one of the researchers of this approach, Hans Johann Gluck, stands head and shoulder above its rivals by dint of its superior clarity, end of quote. Severus of Antioch, Sergius Grammarian, and other followers of Cyril were more precise and more analytic in their theological languages than their master. Their clarity, however, made them split. Christological controversy among the groups that claimed for themselves an exclusive discipleship to Cyril promoted language as the main instrument and subject of theological discussions. The generation of theologians after Cyril took a linguistic turn similar to the one characteristic of the analytic philosophy. Following this turn, theologians made formulas their main instrument of arguing about the incarnation. Theological formulas became almost magical. Theologians and politicians, and I have in mind particularly Justinian, Heraclius, and others, believed that it is enough to reach agreement on formulas to maintain or restore church unity. This was in particular the intention of the Council of Chalcedon and of the Neo-Chalcedonian movement that followed. The magic of the formulas, however, did not work as it was expected. Language may mirror the reality in accordance with the belief of the analytic philosophy, but it was unable to heal the ecclesial schisms and to reconcile the social factions divided by the dogmatic issues. Excessive attention to the Christological languages distracted theologians from what the language was speaking about, Christ himself. It also disintegrated the whole picture of the single Christ which Cyril promoted to the constituents of the incarnation, like nature, hypostasis, property, activity, will, mind, etc. The job of the Byzantine scholastics of the post-Chalcedonian period was similar to the job of an analytic philosopher in our days, who, according to Oliver Crisp, I quote him, is rather like a mechanic who decides to strip an engine down in order to understand why is it making a peculiar rattling sound. He analyzes the parts of the engine, cleans them up, and then reassembles the machine, having satisfied himself that he has addressed the problem so that the engine will work properly once reformed. End of quote. That is exactly what the Byzantine scholastics did in order to fix the ideas and formulas that confused people about the issue of incarnation and hindered the unity of the church. No doubt, analysis of the incarnation accomplished in this way was a useful process which enriched theology and produced a lot of pristine terms and formulas that we still use now. At the same time, it did not help the church unity to be restored, and sometimes made its divisions even deeper. Analytic approach to Christology in the era after Cyril enhanced a tendency of theology to become scholastic. It produced a pre-medieval form of scholasticism. Reduction of Christ to Christological formulas in the post-Chalcedonian Byzantine scholasticism introduced to the theological epistemology a dichotomy of subject-object in a Kantian sense, something that Cyril avoided himself. Passage from Cyril's theological method to the scholasticism of his disciples resembles the famous shift from the first-person knowledge as supported by phenomenology to the third-person knowledge as supported by analytic epistemology. In conclusion, methodology I have chosen helps understanding better the shift from Cyril to the Cyrillites. The difference between them can be illustrated by the difference between phenomenology and the analytic philosophy. The shift from Cyril to the Cyrillites was caused by the need for clarity in articulating the dogma of incarnation. To meet this need, the theologians after Cyril relied on the theological languages. The theological shift of the 5th, 6th centuries, thus, was linguistic. It led to emergence of the earliest form of scholasticism. According to this pre-medieval, the late antiquity scholasticism, Christology was placed to the Kantian frame of subject-object. Christ became an object addressed in third person, not the second person as Cyril preferred to deal with the Christological issues. Christ turned to an object of the theological formulas. The goal of the Christological formulas was to achieve church unity on the basis of the common theological language. Unfortunately, the linguistic shift from Cyril to the Cyrillites did not work in achieving this goal. Thank you.
We have plenty of time for questions. Dan, yes.
I wonder if Cyril might even be descriptive about the duality, not only the unity,
Yeah.
but his formula looking at Jesus as God, Theos, as man, a very common way that he describes Christ, is itself kind of an observable thing. You see how he acts, and so you see what he is. And that would seem to me to be more observable. And so while he says that the duality is just theoretical, he actually treats it, I think, in a certain sense, as observable.
Yeah.
But he sees the single subject acting either as God or as man.
Yeah.
So in a sense, the duality also has this phenomenological side in Cyril's thought.
Yeah, probably so. But, well, I believe that the departure point for Cyril was the unity of Christ. And certainly he contemplated theoretically not divinity, but the distinction between the divinity and humanity, something that was a reality, a separable reality for Nestorius and others. And that is, I think, the difference. So the thing which constituted a subject of contemplation for Cyril was a real division for the other group. And that is, I think, the difference between them. And this makes Cyril closer to phenomenology. I don't claim that he was a phenomenologist, certainly. Such things didn't exist at the time. But he obviously, well, he featured some elements of analytic, probably philosophy, whatever. But certainly he was closer to, I think, to the modern school of phenomenology. And I think, well, my point is exactly that this distinction between Cyril himself and his followers in terms of modern schools of philosophy is helpful to understand actually the difference between them and what shifts happened at the time.
You have characterized Cyril as a man who is not really a philosopher, more devotional, and of course he doesn't use explicitly Aristotelian categories in the letters to Nestorius, but he does use explicitly Aristotelian categories, for example, in the second book of the De Trinitate.
Yeah.
So is it that he's not philosophical, or just that he doesn't think it's appropriate for this particular dispute?
No, he was philosophical, certainly, because the categories of Aristotle, siphoned through the Neoplatonic Porphyrian interpretation of the categories, constituted the common base for everyone. Philosophers, those people of prayer, church leaders, whatever. So Cyril actually dwelt and built on that common ground. He was certainly a philosopher, of course. But my point is that I believe that his followers which include the followers who include also people from the opposite camps like Severus and Sergius the Grammarian, particularly the Chalcedonian camp, Sergius the Grammarian. They were more theoretical about Christ, well, in some sense, because they operated with Christ as a model, and that's why they applied heavily more distinct terminology, philosophical terminology. Hence, they employed the categories of will, will, energy, and so forth, which Cyril himself didn't really take from the repository of the Aristotelian categories. So I think he was a philosopher. Certainly, he was philosophical, but maybe his followers were even more.
Right, as the seed of unity. And that seed of unity is clearly perceptible and manifest for two aspects, right? On the other hand, Cyril, right, if we think that his insistence on the unity of subject, and in this case, subject is subject of predication or subject for existence, right? And both types are kind of different types in a sense. So, I mean, if you think of it in that way, right, then we can also argue that the story is more phenomenological, kind of, and Cyril is more analytic, sort of like logical.
Yeah. Well, I think in this regard we should not confuse the representation of the unity of Christ in Nestorius as the phenomenon or as revelation of the unity of the divinity and humanity in Christ through the prosopon with phenomenology, because it's just a confusion of the terms. Phenomenon of the unity of Christ in Nestorius is not exactly, it's not necessarily phenomenological. Because I think the construct, the logic of Nestorius was that his departure point exactly was the duality in Christ. And then because Christ was one thing, one being, Nestorius had somehow to bridge those two realities which he contemplated together, and hence he produced this concept of the prosopon. So I think of the difference between Nestorius, well, speaking roughly, and Cyril was the departure point for Cyril was unity. For Nestorius, it was duality, and unity was a thing which we can observe, which is a reality, while duality is something that we can really contemplate. So the contemplative departure point makes Nestorius, I think, less maybe phenomenological than Cyril.
Well, thank you for insightful paper.